You've heard about God sending angels, about prophets receiving visions, but sometimes the weight of human rebellion grows so heavy that heaven itself bends low. Sometimes God does not simply send a messenger, he comes down. After the flood, the world was washed clean, the soil was soft, rivers carved their paths, and families of Noah's sons began to spread once more. They carried memories of judgment, of the ark, of the God who had spared 8 souls when all others perished. For a time, the awe of heaven was still fresh in their minds. One language bound them together, one speech carried their thoughts, one story tied them to the past. But memory fades, like wind eroding stone. Reverence weakens with generations. Fear of God became fear of the unknown. Trust became ambition. They journeyed eastward, away from the old lands, into the wide plain of Shinar, a fertile basin where black soil met golden sunlight, a cradle that would later give birth to Mesopotamian brilliance. Here, invention flourished the rhythm of music, the marks of early mathematics, the symbols of writing pressed into clay. And here, men discovered something that would change their destiny: how to burn brick. No longer bound to rough stones from the earth, they could now mold and fire endless bricks, strong and uniform. With bitumen drawn from the earth's pits as mortar, they built with speed, with ambition, with pride. Where bricks multiplied, so did cities. Where cities rose, so did leaders. And where leaders gathered, ideas spread. One idea towered above them all. Come, let us build ourselves a city, with a tower that reaches to the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered across the face of the whole earth. It did not begin with violence. It began with pride disguised as unity. We are one, they said. We are strong. But beneath their declaration was quiet rebellion. God had commanded humanity to spread out, to fill the earth, to steward its breadth. Instead, they resisted. They would not scatter outward, they would build upward, a monument to their greatness, a stairway to the heavens. Archaeologists believe such a tower may have resembled a ziggurat, massive stepped structures rising above Mesopotamian cities. The Babylonians would later call one such tower Etemenanki, the foundation of heaven and earth. These ziggurats were not temples people entered, but artificial mountains meant as meeting points for gods to descend. Humanity's tower in Shinar was not an act of worship, it was an act of defiance. They sought to summon heaven on their own terms, to bring God down to their city, under their control. And the Lord came down, not with armies, not with fire, not with thunder, but to see. Genesis describes it simply. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the people were building. The words carry irony. Men thought their tower brushed the skies. Yet for the Almighty, he still came down to look upon it. The project that men boasted as heaven's gate was to God a speck on the plains. The Lord saw not merely the tower, but the heart behind it. Behold, they are one people, and they all have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing they propose will now be impossible for them. The danger was not height, but unity without humility, ambition without dependence on God. Left unchecked, their pride would spread like fire, so God himself intervened. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so that they will not understand one another's speech. And suddenly, words fractured. Where once voices flowed with a single tongue, now confusion rose. One called for a brick, another brought water. One asked for mortar, another for straw. Misunderstanding turned to frustration, frustration to division, and the work halted. The tower, once rising with speed, stood unfinished, a monument to human arrogance cut short by the will of heaven. They were scattered, not by sword, not by famine, but by language. The very gift that bound them was transformed into a barrier. Nations formed, tribes split, cultures blossomed, humanity spread, filling the earth just as God had commanded. What they feared most scattering became their destiny. What they resisted, obedience, became their reality. The city was called Babel, for there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. To later generations, it would symbolize humanity's restless pride, its attempt to climb to heaven without God. Empires would echo its ambition: Babylon, Nineveh, Rome, all towers of pride destined to fall. But notice the mercy. God's descent at Babel was not destruction. He did not send fire as he would on Sodom. He did not unleash plagues as he would on Egypt. He confused, he scattered, he restrained. Pride was broken not with blood, but with barriers. Humanity's ambition was humbled, yet humanity itself was preserved. The story of Babel is more than ancient history. It is a pattern. When men exalt their name above God's, when unity becomes idolatry, when progress forgets its maker, God descends, sometimes in judgment, sometimes in mercy, always to remind us that heaven is not reached by brick and bitumen, but by his will alone. Thus begins the story of divine descent. From the plains of Shinar, where pride sought to climb, to the valleys of Egypt, where chains groaned in silence. Scripture shows us again and again when man forgets heaven. Heaven does not forget man. Egypt, jewel of the ancient world. Its temples glistened in the desert sun. Its monuments carved into stone declared its kings eternal. Pharaohs were not merely rulers, they were gods on earth, embodiments of order and power. Egypt called itself everlasting, but its empire was built on the backs of slaves. Israel had once entered Egypt with favor. Joseph, a Hebrew, had risen to power and saved nations from famine. But centuries passed, and the memory of Joseph faded like dust in the wind. A new Pharaoh arose who knew nothing of him, and so the Hebrews, once welcomed, became shackled. They were driven into pits to mold clay and straw into bricks. Their sons were slaughtered, their backs split beneath whips, their cries silenced under orders that never ceased. To Egyptians, the Hebrews were numbers, labor, flesh for empire. But in heaven, their groans rose as incense. Scripture says their cries reached God not in polished prayers, but in raw pain. The kind of lament heaven never ignores. God did not come suddenly. First, he sent a man, Moses, once a prince of Egypt, now a shepherd of Midian, called through fire that burned but did not consume. I have surely seen the affliction of my people, and I have come down to deliver them. Those words were not metaphor. Egypt was about to learn what it meant when God himself intervenes. 10 plagues struck the land, each one a blow not only against Pharaoh but against Egypt's gods. The Nile bled red, silencing Hapi, the river deity. Frogs swarmed, and Heket, the frog-headed goddess of fertility, did not answer. Darkness swallowed the land, and Ra, the sun god, could not rise. Cattle fell dead in the fields, and Hathor, goddess of motherhood, was powerless. One by one, idols of stone and gold were exposed as empty thrones. But Pharaoh's heart hardened. Each plague was a chance to yield, a warning, an invitation. Yet Pharaoh mocked, tightening chains, ridiculing a God he could not see. His refusal stirred the Lord who hears. The final word was spoken: judgment would fall on every firstborn in Egypt. That night was unlike any other. No army marched, no sword clashed. Judgment moved in silence, a shadow passing from door to door. The command had been given to Israel: take a lamb without blemish, slaughter it, smear its blood upon the doorposts, roast its flesh, and eat in haste. For when the destroyer passed through the land, he would strike down every house without blood upon its frame. And so, while Egyptians feasted unaware, Hebrew families huddled in homes marked by crimson. Children asked their fathers why blood stained the wood, and fathers whispered, "Because tonight the Lord passes over us." At midnight, the silence broke. A cry rose in the darkness. One house, then another, then thousands. From Pharaoh's palace to the lowliest hut, death entered Egypt. The firstborn of man and beast fell, and the land groaned in anguish. There was no corner untouched, no God that could protect, no throne that could resist. Yet in Goshen, where lamb's blood shone upon doorframes, there was peace, not a cry, not a shadow, only deliverance. Because when God comes down, his judgment does not fall blindly. He makes a distinction. The blood was the sign. Where blood covered, mercy reigned. Egypt was broken that night. Pharaoh summoned Moses in grief and terror, driving Israel out with haste. But this was not merely escape, it was revelation. God did not only defeat Pharaoh, he dethroned the gods of Egypt. He did not only free Israel, he claimed them as his own. Deliverance was not the end, it was the beginning. From the ruins of Egypt, he led his people into the wilderness, not to wander aimlessly, not to hide, but to meet him. They had seen his power in judgment. Now they would see his presence in fire. Israel had left Egypt behind. The Red Sea lay parted and closed again. Pharaoh's chariots swallowed by the deep. Manna fell from heaven. Water poured from rocks. And at last the people reached the mountain of God. They were not told to prepare for war, but for something far greater, to meet the Lord himself. Go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their garments and be ready by the third day, because on that day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. No animal could cross the boundary set at the mountain's base. No hand could touch the holy peak. Because this was not just a meeting, this was an arrival, a collision of heaven and earth. On the morning of the third day, the wilderness itself seemed to tremble. Thunder cracked. Lightning split the sky. A dense cloud descended like smoke from a furnace. A trumpet blast grew louder and louder, shaking every heart. The mountain blazed with fire, and the people gathered not to sing, not to speak, but to behold. And then they heard it, not through Moses, not through an angel, but directly from God. "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me." The ground quaked, the air split with sound. The 10 Commandments thundered from the mountaintop. For the first and only time in history, God spoke his covenant law not to a prophet alone, but to an entire nation, and Israel trembled. They withdrew, begging Moses, "You speak to us, and we will listen, but let not God speak to us, lest we die." The mountain scene was terrifying, yet it revealed something profound. God comes down not only to judge, but to covenant. He had broken Egypt's chains. Now he bound Israel to himself. The people who had been no nation were becoming his kingdom of priests. The fire was not only power, it was presence. But the story of divine descent is not confined to Sinai's thunder. Sometimes God comes not with earthquake and flame, but in quiet encounters that alter history forever. Long before Sinai, in the land of Mesopotamia, a man named Abram heard a voice, not thunder, not trumpet, just a call: "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you." Abram obeyed. He built altars in Canaan, trusting a promise he could not yet see. Yet the world around him burned with violence. Kings from the east marched with armies, subjugating cities, demanding tribute. Sodom and Gomorrah rebelled, and Lot, Abram's nephew, was swept away in the tide of war, carried captive by conquerors who seemed unstoppable. But Abram remembered the promise. To your descendants I will give this land. He gathered 318 of his own servants, men untrained in war but trained in faith. By night they pursued the kings as far as Damascus. In a surprise attack, swift and precise, they routed armies that had crushed nations. Lot was freed, captives restored, plunder recovered. And then, in the valley of Shava, something unexpected happened. A man approached. He bore no army, carried no banner. Instead, he brought bread and wine. His name was Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of God Most High. He blessed Abram. Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. Abram, victorious yet humbled, gave him a tenth of everything, because deep down, Abram knew this was no ordinary priest. Melchizedek appeared without genealogy, without beginning or end, like a figure stepping out of eternity. King of Salem peace, King of righteousness. He blessed with bread and wine, symbols that would echo millennia later in the upper room, when another priest-king would break bread and pour wine, sealing a covenant with his blood. Here was another descent, quiet yet profound. God revealed himself not only in thunder on Sinai, but in peace through a mysterious priest. Both moments carried the same truth: victory does not come by might, but by covenant. Yet while Abram bowed to blessing, the cities of the plain returned to their corruption. Sodom had been spared once through Abram's rescue, but mercy did not soften them. They grew bolder, darker, more violent. The cries of the innocent rose again to heaven, and soon judgment would descend once more. One hot afternoon, near the oaks of Mamre, Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing before his tent. Dust clung to their feet, yet their presence carried weight beyond flesh. Abraham hurried to meet them, bowing low to the ground. He called them my lord and begged them to stay. Bread was baked, water drawn, a calf prepared. In the simple rhythm of hospitality, the Eternal brushed against the mortal once more. One of the visitors spoke a promise Sarah would bear a son. But when the meal ended, the tone shifted. 2 of the men turned toward Sodom. The Lord remained with Abraham. And the question rose, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? The outcry against Sodom was great. In that valley, power had turned into perversion, justice into mockery, strangers into prey. Violence was no longer hidden, it was celebrated in the streets. And heaven had heard the cries. Abraham, trembling yet bold, pleaded, Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? What followed was a negotiation of mercy. 50 righteous, 40, 30, 20, 10. And God said, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. But 10 could not be found. When the 2 angels entered Sodom, Lot recognized them, bowed, and begged them to stay under his roof. As night fell, the city gathered like a mob, pressing against his door, demanding the strangers be brought out. The line between cruelty and lust dissolved into chaos. In that moment, mercy's limit was reached. The angels struck the crowd with blindness and seized Lot's hand. Take your family and go, for we can do nothing until you are safe. At dawn, the sky tore open. Fire and sulfur rained from heaven, turning the fertile valley into wasteland. Smoke rose like a furnace, and the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah became ashes. Abraham watched from the hills, the place where he had once interceded. He saw judgment fall, but he also saw the mercy that spared Lot. The story of Sodom is not just about destruction. It is about a God who listens, a God who allows intercession, a God who distinguishes between the righteous and the wicked. Yet it is also about a God whose justice, when spurned, cannot be mocked forever. From Babel to Egypt, from Sinai to Sodom, Scripture tells us again and again when humanity's pride rises too high, when cruelty silences the innocent, when cities exalt themselves against heaven, God comes down, sometimes in confusion, sometimes in plagues, sometimes in fire, but always with purpose, to scatter pride, to dethrone idols, to covenant with his people, to walk with his friend, to judge the wicked. But all these descents were glimpses, shadows of something greater. For in times past, God spoke through prophets, through fire, through angels. Yet in the fullness of time, he came down in a way no one expected, not in smoke and thunder, but in silence, not to shatter cities, but to bear their judgment, not clothed in fire, but wrapped in swaddling cloths. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. He touched lepers, wept at graves, fed the hungry, forgave sinners. He bore the judgment of the world upon a cross. And when he rose from the dead, he proved that the final descent of God was not to destroy, but to redeem. The God who once came down in judgment now comes in mercy. The same God who scattered at Babel now gathers the nations. The same God who thundered at Sinai now speaks with a human voice. The same God who rained fire on Sodom now sends his spirit like fire into willing hearts. And one day, he will come down again not hidden in weakness, but revealed in glory, not as servant, but as king. Until that day, the stories remain warnings and promises, judgments and mercies. They remind us that heaven has never been silent. When man forgets heaven, heaven does not forget man. From Babel's tower to Egypt's plagues, from Sinai's fire to Sodom's ashes, every story echoes the same truth when humanity forgets heaven. Heaven does not forget humanity. God descends not always in wrath, but often in mercy. He comes to scatter pride, to break false gods, to covenant with his people, and finally, to walk among us in the person of Jesus Christ. The Incarnation was not just another descent, it was the ultimate one. God did not only visit, he dwelt among us. He bore our judgment, carried our sorrows, and rose to reign. And one day, he will come down again, not hidden in weakness, but revealed in glory. Until that day, these stories call us to remember, to watch, and to prepare. They are not only about ancient civilizations. They are about us, our pride, our idols, our need for mercy, and our longing for the King who is coming soon. If these truths stir your heart, we invite you to journey with us further. Here, we explore the mysteries of Scripture, the lessons of history, and the hope that anchors the soul. Subscribe to this channel, not merely to follow content, but to stand with a community of watchmen, those who keep their lamps burning, who listen for the trumpet, who wait for the dawn. Stay watchful, stay faithful, and together, let us lift our eyes, for the same God who once came down will come again.